Welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Corby and I am the president of the Association for Distance Education and Independent Learning. And I'm going to kick us off for our keynote today. I hope you have enjoyed your morning sessions, and it is my honor now to introduce this year's keynote speaker, Dr. Craig Swenson, president of Ashford University. Dr. Swenson has spent over 30 years teaching and learning in adults serving universities that have been pioneers in online and competency-based instruction. Dr. Swenson has served as Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Western Governors University, Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at the University of Phoenix System, Interim President of University of the Rockies, and as Chancellor of the Ogosi University System. Dr. Swenson earned his PhD in education from Walden University, his master's degree in organizational communication from Brigham Young University, and his baccalaureate degree in journalism and mass communication from the University of Utah. He is an active peer reviewer and accreditation team chair for the Commission on Senior Colleges of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, and has served as a member of the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, the U.S. Army Education Advisory Committee, and as a board member for the Council of Higher Education. His keynote today is titled, "What I've Learned About Teaching from Teachers and by Teaching." Welcome, Dr. Swenson.
Thank you, Dr. Corby, for the very kind introduction and for inviting me to be here today. Unlike a lot of speeches that I've given, I'm prone to procrastination. But I began thinking about this as soon as I was asked. It was one of those stream of consciousness experiences. And of course, I've added a little bit to it since, but I knew what I wanted and needed to say. And the title came later. I'd been asked a few times and finally just said, go ahead and put what I've learned about teaching from teachers and by teaching. And that'll do for now, because I believe in teaching and I believe in teachers. To me, teaching is a calling. It's like a vocation. And I realized when I began teaching, after I received my master's degree, I started teaching, and I had taught, in workplace settings and others before, but when I started teaching at the university level as an adjunct at different institutions, I found that I came alive in a classroom, and I'm sure that is true of many of you. I've taught as an adult educator for years that the job of adult educators is to facilitate learning, using the term facilitate, which I still believe and feel that way. But I will tell you, I'm sometimes get a little weary of the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage, because while it's a useful concept, it's become a little glib. At my center, I define myself, or what I hope is my true self, as a teacher. I feel the way Parker Palmer, and that's a name that many of you might know, who was an inspirational teacher. He wrote this. He said, "I'm a teacher at heart, and there are moments in the classroom when I can hardly hold the joy. When my students and I discover uncharted territory to explore, when the pathway out of a thicket opens up before us, when our experience is illumined by the lightning life of the mind, then teaching is the finest work I know." And I feel that way. He also recounts the times when it didn't work and it fell flat, and I've had those too. We're in a very unique situation when we talk about online and distance learning, because teaching is more difficult. And that doesn't mean that we're still not teaching or ought not to be teaching. it just, the medium has an impact on what we can do. I'd like to talk, though, about what I've learned about teachers, about teaching from teachers, and by teaching myself. And in doing so, I want to reemphasize my personal belief that the purpose of education is not teaching, the purpose of education is learning. And that teaching and learning aren't the same thing. My teaching doesn't mean that my students are learning. Teaching is a calling, but it's also a craft. And my job as a teacher is to help my students learn, to know that they know what they should know and can do what they should be able to do. So I'd like to pose a question to you to think about. And you can use the chat function to answer. There's a two-word term, and this is so easy. Two-word term that's become universal to describe education during a pandemic. And I'm going to leave you to that for just a minute. And I'd like you to use the chat function if you would. And I'm going to turn off the camera for 1 second and just let you think about it. And then I'd like you to tell me what you think, if you think about that term, what it means to you. Okay. Let's see. Mobile learning, hybrid learning, remote learning, distance learning. Any others? Distance learning. Yeah, Jen, yes, there's a two-word term that has become, that's been used to describe education during the pandemic in the last 6 months. And somebody hit on it. Not virtual. No, no, it's not a potty word. Unprecedented times, that's true. One of you had it early on. Part of it. Okay, I'm going to help you out here. Right, there we go, remote learning. Remote learning. I'd like you to think about that term. We say it almost now without thinking what we're saying. I'm working remotely, as many of you are. My wife and I have two sons, a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old, who are learning remotely. They're, because of the pandemic, they're in our makeshift schoolroom just down the hall. And why I just think I've thought a lot about, as I've thought this, what does remote learning imply at a deeper level? Because in one way, there's no such thing as remote learning. One of the definitions of remote in the dictionary is having very little connection with or relation to, as in the theory seems rather intellectual and remote from everyday experience. And there's also an implication that face-to-face learning is better. Obviously, who would question that face-to-face isn't better? Well, I will tell you that as an undergraduate, and I'm sure many of you had the same experience, I sat in the back of some 400 student auditoriums where that face-to-face professor seemed and was pretty darned remote. And so I'd like to just play with the word a little bit. Learning is not remote. learning is personal. Learning is subjective. Learning is social and relational. And with the exception perhaps of certain autodidacts, we often think of Abraham Lincoln as an autodidact. Learning is all about relationships. Bandera coined the phrase in his research, social learning. Even in the case of Lincoln, I doubt that it was isolated. He borrowed books and he talked with people and he tried it out even though he didn't have formal teachers, and he taught himself a great deal. We know that he was an extremely social person. Learning is social and it is about relationships. It's about making connections and it's about engaging and being engaged with. Recently, Jeffrey Harpham wrote a book called What Do You Think, Mr. Ramirez? And that book, his book takes its title from an anecdote. Professor Harpham met a Cuban immigrant who said he had come to the US undocumented and penniless. And by the way, I would highly recommend the book. He earned a GED, found his way into the community college literature course on Shakespeare. And sitting in the back of class, as so many of our students in class do, we often say they can't hide in an online classroom, but they can, like they did in face-to-face classroom, averting their eyes and trying not to be seen. And one day in class, the professor asked him, Ramirez, what do you think? And that question, said Mr. Ramirez, changed his life, because it was the first time anyone had ever asked me what I thought. That one question led Mr. Ramirez on a life's course, becoming a distinguished professor. And I don't know how that story affects you, but I know how it affects me. And when I read that book, I thought of an old friend named Celestino Fernandez. I met Celestino when he was an ACE fellow serving at the university where I worked. Celestino's parents were migrant farmers. When he came to the US, he didn't speak English. He went to middle school because he was required to go. And there a teacher took interest in him, took an interest. He is now an eminent sociologist, emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And he's a gifted poet. He used to share his poetry with me. He and I haven't spoken for years, but I remember his story. And I could have named this talk all because of a teacher. I am sure that every one of us in this room can look back over our lifetime in education and point to teachers who all because of that teacher, I'm where I am today. And so I'd like to talk about some teachers I've known, if you don't mind me waxing personal and a little bit emotional, if you'll forgive me. And at each level of education, I was a small, unconfident fifth grade boy. I had started school early. I had just gotten under the deadline, started kindergarten as a 4-year-old, and was always the youngest and smallest kid in class. And probably unprepared for that with the bigger kids. And so I was a victim. And in my 5th grade class, Paul Miller, it was one of his first years as a teacher. He was right out of Utah State University, 6'5", imposing, wonderful, wonderful man. And he would do everything he could to recognize me. He would, when we went out at recess or at lunchtime, he would always engage me to play ball with him as a way to get other boys playing with us and to help me work in. He recognized something in me. About a year ago, I looked him up. I hadn't seen him for years. He had become a school principal and was eminently loved and successful, and I was not surprised. But I called and tracked him down and called him because I hadn't spoken with him since I was in the 5th grade, and found him, talked with his wife. She said he would love to talk with you. He hasn't been well. And I said, thank you, and told him what I was doing now. And both of us started to cry. All because of a teacher. My 7th grade English teacher was 10 years older than me. She had just graduated. 7th grade, who would want to repeat that experience? And she was teaching English. And believe it or not, she taught me how to write, how to diagram sentences. And I look back to her as the beginning of why I love to write today. And later on, moved into the same neighborhood as an adult, and we struck up a friendship and are friends to this day. But Linda, all but for a teacher. In high school, my debate coach was named Kim Birmingham and took an interest in me. He also was one of the best drama coaches in the state, and we won debate championships and drama championships. He ended up being the head of the state school board in Utah for years. But the day I remember the most is sitting in class, and we were messing around. It was getting toward the end of the year, and he had just come back from a funeral of one of his teachers, one of his elementary school teachers. And we were behaving rather privileged, I'm sure. And he gave us a good bawling out and told us the story of this teacher during World War II, when the mothers were working in the factories and the fathers were at war, and this lady who would wipe their noses and make sure they had shoes and that their clothes were clean. And to this day, I remember that experience. And the humility that he conveyed and the gratitude. And then I say again, all but for a teacher. In my undergraduate program, Perry Sorensen. Perry was a tall, sort of eyes that pointed in a different direction, great big feet, had been a member of the FBI, was the head of PR at the University of Utah. He told me, when he was my advisor in my undergraduate program, and told me that the reason they didn't have all that many courses is he wanted me to get a liberal education, learn as much as I could about as much as I could, and that would make me better. But he forced me to take 2 news writing courses, and that's where I really learned to write. And I look back, Perry was always, he would, when I had finally landed a job out of college, every couple of years he would call me to see what I was doing, and made such a huge difference in my life, and would always offer recommendations for me wherever I went. So I again say, all because of a teacher. And finally, I have others, but in my master's program, I want to tell one story. My mentor, and usually became a partner later, Brent Peterson, was one of the fathers of the field of organization of organizational communication. But I remember one experience in one of the early courses I took from him, and I was giving some kind of report or answering a question, and I talked about the sociologist Max Weber. Well, I didn't know it was Weber, but I know that I sounded, and probably to some of my classmates, I sounded kind of silly. I should have known that. He didn't say anything, but after class, he pulled me aside and sort of whispered and said, "You should know it's Max Weber." He said, "You're a great student. You're going to do great things. You just want to make sure that you get the name right." Now, that was a tiny little thing. But I say once again, these teachers special. Well, simply put, I mattered to them. And it wasn't just that I mattered, they saw something in me. And you've all heard talks like this, but I want to take it to a little bit different place. Before I do, though, I want to read an article that was in the Washington Post a couple of days ago, if I can find it here. Let's see. I had not sure. So I will find it. Hold on just one second. Okay, I got it here. This article, and you will recognize some teachers in it. This is about Eric Hale. Eric Hale is the first Black man named Texas Teacher of the Year. And of course, in a humble statement, he said, "I'm not the first to deserve it." Eric Hale's childhood was marred by abuse and poverty. His mother struggled with drug addiction and his stepfather with schizophrenia. "It was a tough cycle," said Hale, 40, adding that as a child he had little hope for his future. After years of struggle, though, he did succeed. Hale was named the 2021 Texas Teacher of the Year, becoming the first Black man to receive the honor out of more than 360,000 teachers. I'm the first to win, but not the first to deserve it. He teaches first and second grade at David Burnett Elementary School in Dallas, where 98% of the students live below the poverty line. For Hale, becoming an educator is about more than teaching letters and numbers. "I'm a teacher because I'm chasing the ghost of an educator I needed as a child." He said, "My mission is to make sure that children who are going through poverty and traumatic experiences get the hope they need." His own childhood trauma steeled him. He said, supplying him with the necessary tools to reach out to children living through similar circumstances. Growing up in West Phoenix, Arizona, I won't go through it all, but he said, all I ever received was sympathy, which eventually turned into apathy from teachers. I needed action. I needed accountability. His childhood best friend, Derek Self, described Hale's challenges at home and the economically challenged high crime neighborhood they grew up in. When you come out of the environment he's from, either it consumes you or you rise above it. There's really no middle. And this is what I wanted to say. It's not always a school teacher. In 7th grade, Hale moved in with his grandmother in Portland, Oregon, and remained there until his senior year. Living with his grandmother shifted his path, allowing him to refocus on his studies and his future. I started becoming more well-read. Hale said, I felt like nothing could stop me. Once I got out of the negative situation, I realized I was actually pretty smart and talented. He graduated from Wright State University, was able to attend through financial aid. His mission was to become a teacher. Soon after arriving in Dallas more than a decade ago, he began teaching at David Burnett Elementary School and has been there ever since. He quickly became known for his unconventional teaching style and his steadfast dedication to his students and their family. The impact he has had on our campus is huge, said the principal of the school. He knows what it means to be hungry. If a child is hungry, he will do what it takes to feed that child. His kids almost always outperform in academics, and parents are always thankful. He infuses music into the lesson. He has a DJ booth in the corner. I'm going to encourage the rest of you to read that article from the Washington Post a few days ago. But I thought it would help to think about that, and just to reinforce. There's a story about a young professor, and I apologize to those of my colleagues who've heard this before. Young professor, first class, teaching a large section of a course, and on the test, the department test for that section, his students didn't do very well. And his dean called him in and said, what's up here? Your students didn't do very well. He said, well, I covered all the material. He said, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And his dean said, that's fine, except your job isn't to lead them to the water, it's to make them thirsty. And I want to talk about that in terms of online education. There are two domains of learning, the cognitive and the affective. And we usually think of the cognitive as the most important. It's the intellectual side. But the affective side, the emotional and motivational side, really has to come first. It is the gateway. The affective is the gateway to the cognitive. And we tend to think about cognitive as real learning. But the affective, you can't get to the cognitive without it. Paulo Freire knew that when he was teaching the Andean peasant farmers how to read. He taught them how to read in terms of their political struggle. He situated the context so that it was important to them. And he cared about them. One of my earlier mentors said that the reason that his educational model had been so successful is that he placed 50% of the emphasis on the affective. And it was that opened the door to the cognitive and helped students remain. My earlier mentor that I mentioned, Brent Peterson, developed a 5E model of learning. And the first and largest section, the greatest percentage, is the excite portion, getting people excited about learning. Now, how do you get people excited about learning? Well, some of it is to design lesson plans. Some of it is to look for what motivates them. Malcolm Knowles said that adults are ready to learn when they have to learn it. Oftentimes there are so many competing forces, but when they have to learn something, they're ready to learn it. That doesn't mean that they always recognize that or want to. How does that relate then to the online and distance learning dilemma? Because it is a bit of a dilemma for us. us. And I think there are three things we can do, and I've talked about this before, three things that every faculty member can do in the online classroom or in an independent learning session when you're working one-on-one and have the privilege to work one-on-one with a student. One is to humanize the classroom. Let them see you. Let them see you as a person. You're a teacher. And I remember Stephen Brookfield saying one of the biggest mistakes that teachers of adults often make is they will say, well, I'm here just the same as you. I'm going to learn as much from you in this course as you will. And he said, they're paying you a lot of money to learn, and they expect you to be the expert. They want someone to look up to, but they want to know that you're accessible. And so humanizing the classroom, let them see you, make it possible for them to speak with you if that's possible. Now, sometimes the setting doesn't allow for that, but to have office hours and to make sure that you're responsive and speak with students on the phone or on Zoom if possible. Create your course site so that they can see who you are and they know you. That's the first way. The second is, depending on the tools you use, if you're using discussion boards, be there. I remember going on an accreditation visit, and the provost of the institution, it was an online institution, said, well, that's the place where the student can interact. And that's true, but to me, the teachers were kind of abdicating their responsibility. One of the things I studied was discussion leadership. How do you lead a discussion? And the visibility of a faculty member in the discussion is important, not to capitalize, not to direct, or it's to make them thirsty. Ask them questions. What do you think, Mr. Ramirez? And so involvement in that and guiding the discussion through and cajoling sometimes and complimenting and reinforcing, all of those are absolutely, that's a critical part of making online discussion leadership work, in my opinion. And I look at the way that we organize those discussions, and I don't think we do a very good job of that. I think we expect students to make a certain number of posts. If the faculty member is running that correctly, the students will want to post. They won't be doing it because they're required to post. And the third, and this comes out of a study that Chickering and Gamson did years ago. It was back in the late 70s or 80s, called 7 Principles of Good Practice in Undergraduate Education. I think it's good practice anytime. But one of those 7 related to feedback. Another way that we show that we care is by the feedback that we give them. It's personal. And I know sometimes we don't have the time to do that. It takes time to give good feedback, but the volume and quality of feedback communicates something to that student in an online setting. And it says, this faculty member cares about me. Now, we have a great tool at Ashford. It's called Waypoint, and it has a comment bank that faculty members can use to give feedback in a more automated way. I think that's good, but think about it. The second or third time the student sees that same comment, they're pretty smart and they recognize that that wasn't really from us. It's a good tool for us, and sometimes we have to use those helps. But that's the volume and quality of feedback that we give students on their work products speaks volumes. There is a barrier sometimes in online education. We need to overcome that. And I will tell you that I know, because I hear from our students and I speak with them every time we've been able to have an in-person graduation, and our last two haven't been able to be. I meet with students and their families and to be able to take pictures. And I will tell you that the thing that comes to me every time is that somebody along the way, they're there at graduation because somebody caught their interest and paid attention. And you would think in an online classroom, oh, it's just all the cognitive stuff, but it's not. It's as much affective. And so I put that out simply as some thought. Yes, we're facilitators and we're guides to learning, but we're teachers. And we do it out of the passion, and all because of a teacher. So I'm very grateful that I've had the experience of teaching in a face-to-face classroom, but I've also found great joy in teaching in the online classroom. And it's all in how we do it. And anyway, I am so appreciative of the opportunity to be here today, and I know that there might be a little time for questions, and I would be very happy to have a discussion with you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swenson. We do have a few minutes for discussion, so if anyone has some comments or questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. So we have a question here for you, Dr. Swenson, about your tips and tricks for time management.
Well, that's a trick question, because I know how when you're teaching a number of students in a number of classes, it's really hard to organize your time, because you have so many, and how do you find time for that one? I wish I had the answer for that. Some of that has to do with how we organize learning. Some of it has to do with how we prepare so that we automate the things that we can automate, and then try and set aside a certain amount of time to correspond and nudge students and email. And if we set aside a little time every day to reach out to individuals, maybe that's the way to do it. And I'm not absolutely sure the best way to accomplish that. I'm really good at talking about it. Doing it is the other thing. And but those are the tricks that I've used. The other is the use of rubrics whenever you can to grade. That will speed up. When I started using a real rubric where I could write notes in, I could give the grade, but write notes in and say, here's what you did well, that personalized the feedback that I gave them. If you're just writing on a paper or typing on in the margins of a paper, that's difficult. But if you're using a rubric and you can actually type in feedback, that helps. How do I see online learning teaching changing post-COVID? That's a terrific question. I don't know. I think, we talk about some new normal. I look at what higher education is going through right now, and who knows what it's going to look like. We talk about it every day in our executive meetings and with our academic leadership. What does this mean? I do think there are some practical aspects to that. I think the fact that so many folks have gone to, quote, remote learning and are using Zoom, people will get used to it, and it will become more and used more and more. Students will also demand more, and you're seeing that happen in traditional institutions where they're saying, I want more than this. Students go to the there are a lot of students, I think, as everyone knows, who are taking online courses in their dorm rooms. They're residential students because they want the experience of the student, of being a student in that environment. And but online courses are much easier for them to fit into a schedule, and they're not having to get up at 7 in the morning and walk across campus. They can do it at their convenience. And so I think that's going to become more universal, and we'll see. I'm reading the comments.
We do have a question about student loan debt, and any thoughts that you have about student loan debt jubilee or student loan debt forgiveness?
Well, I think the politics of that are tough, but the pandemic has certainly brought that up. If you look at the student loan crisis that we've been living at, that really came out of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. And from a practical standpoint, what happened is state funding of higher education dried up as the tax base, as unemployment rose, the tax base shrank. As the economy dropped, the endowments of many institutions shrank. And where did students go to finance their education? They went to the federal government. And so there was a ballooning of student debt across the entire market. And I think there is the great danger that you will see that again. And so as part of the pandemic relief, I expect that there will be some student loan debt relief more broadly than we've seen. We've seen forays into it. I do anticipate that there will be more of that.
All right, thank you so very much. Dr. Swenson, just on behalf of ADEIL, I want to thank you for joining us today and offering us your thoughts and insights. Was such a productive session, so thank you very much.